Welcome to Hopkins at Home. My name is Rama Chellappa. I am a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, the Whiting School of Engineering, and the Department of Biomedical Engineering in the School of Medicine at Hopkins. My research areas are in computer vision, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. I've been working on these problems for almost 4 decades. And in a moment, I'll welcome Mr. Gary Whitta to join me in a conversation about the role of artificial intelligence. We have captioned this event as AI, Imagination and Reality. Gary will talk about imagination and I'll talk about reality. I'm a technologist, but I'm inspired by what people like Gary can imagine about what AI can do. So as we talk, Gary, and invite you to please share your thoughts and questions in the chat below. We'll dedicate some time near the end of the hour to respond. Gary, welcome to Hopkins at Home.
Yes, hello. Thank you for having me. It's very excited to be here. I'm Gary Whitta, and I'm not in any way distinguished, but I am a science fiction writer, screenwriter, and novelist. I've written for video games, comic books, film, television, and books, and I work primarily in the worlds of kind of genre science fiction and fantasy. And it's very interesting for me to be here with someone like Rama, because as I think you touched upon just a moment ago, there's always been, I think from the very early days of science fiction, going all the way back to, Jules Verne, a kind of a feedback loop between real scientists and science fiction writers and how we kind of inspire each other. I think scientists are inspired by the kind of things that science fiction writers can imagine. And I know that science fiction writers are very much inspired and get a lot of ideas from what's happening, in the real world of scientific endeavor and technological discovery. So it's fascinating for me to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. Robotics has been one of the main application areas of artificial intelligence. And right from childhood, most kids are very enamored of what robots can do and so on. And you have been at the forefront of imagining what robots can do, how AI can shape the way robots are designed and how they interact with humans and so on. Could you start off with how you kind of got involved with this, from Metropolis, movies and so on? You can trace how Star Wars themes developed, the droids developed, and in general discuss, how AI and robots were featured in movies over decades.
Yeah, so I got into science fiction because I loved it as a kid, and I'm trying to think. What was I think the first one. You'll remember this. You'll know this one, Rama. I'm sure it's come up in your research, and as you look to kind of famous robots in history, was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was one of my favorite things that I watched and read when I was a kid. And I was always a big fan of Marvin, the paranoid android, who was like so vastly intelligent that it resulted in becoming deeply depressed and cynical all the time. I just always thought that was really hilarious. And my career as a writer did lead to me getting to work in the Star Wars universe for a number of years. I was one of the writers on Star Wars Rogue One, and I wrote several episodes of Star Wars Rebels, and I've also written Star Wars books and comic books as well. And Rogue One is probably the thing that I'm most well known for, and I think part of the reason why I'm here today was I had a hand in the creation of K2SO, who's the droid from Star Wars Rogue One. And Rama, when you and I spoke kind of in preparation for this, I talked a little bit about how it's interesting. I'm glad to be here, but I actually kind of feel like the droids in Star Wars are often kind of the least interesting or relevant reference point for artificial intelligence, because I know as a Star Wars writer and someone who's worked with other Star Wars writers that when we write the droids in Star Wars, we often don't think of them as droids. We really do write them as human characters, and C-3PO has always been kind of the reference point for that. If you think about C-3PO, he is weirdly in many ways the most human character in Star Wars, because even though he's made of silicone and wires, his neuroses and all his various kind of personality traits, his anxieties, and the way that he kind of talks too much, we all recognize ourselves and people that we know in C-3PO because he's deeply human. And one of the things that Star Wars I don't think has ever really tried to do, because I personally don't even think of Star Wars science fiction. I think of it as more like a fantasy, a fairy tale that just happens to take place in outer space. Is we've always kind of thought of the droids as a delivery mechanism for one of the most human things that there is, which is comedy. When you think about C-3PO, R2-D2, Chopper from Star Wars Rebels, or K2SO, they're all funny, right? Those droids are usually there as a point of comic relief, particularly in the way that they interact with the human characters around them. And I find that fascinating. The idea that in science fiction, you might, if you think of something like from Data from Star Trek, there's a lot of discussion, and a lot of the storytelling is always about that gulf that exists between him being artificial and desperately wanting to be human, right? He's kind of Pinocchio type character, and there's a lot of kind of science fiction. Some of the best science fiction in Star Trek, I think, is done around the character of Data, and is he human? How close is he to really being human? Do we think of him as human or artificial? But in Star Wars, we never really kind of ask any of those questions. We just think of the droids and we write them as human characters that happen to be in artificial bodies.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Gary, because what you have imagined then is still not there in creating a robot, AI robot that can interact with humans like another human. That seems to be a big challenge right now. Because the human AI interaction has become a very, very critical area. For example, if you have, we'll see later on when we talk about AI in medicine, but I can bring it up now and we can revisit again, is when you have AI as an agent, and then you have a doctor and a patient, there has to be some kind of empathy in terms of what AI can suggest and so forth. So what you imagine in terms of a human-like quality for C-3PO is what we are hoping will be able to do, so that the interactions would not be somewhat robot-like or artificial. But it's a big challenge. If you really think back how robots developed, going back to the 60s and 70s, it started as a card. There's a Stanford card that people may know about. And then there was the, at SRI International had a robot. It's a kind of a tall robot with sensors and bumpers and things like that. It's called Shaky. And because they were trying to figure out what name they should give, and this thing was shaking a lot, so they called it Shaky. And it created some foundational AI algorithms. The famous A-star algorithm came out of that. How transform in computer vision came out of that, and some of the senior people in AI research were involved in that. Hans Moravec, who actually worked on it when he was at Stanford, then moved to CMU and was involved in creating Robotic Institute. Of course, now we are having agent theory is one of the theories, and in AI in terms of how to multiple agents can interact with each other and so on. But we're still not there in terms of the human-like quality that you were able to imagine and build narratives and stories. C-3PO and K2S and so on is what we are dreaming of, so that the interactions are natural. Yeah, take it away.
Yeah, I think the point that you make about how we're very critical at AI is a really good one. And I, as a representative of kind of the science fiction creative community, I think we take some responsibility for that, because I think one of the reasons why we are so critical of AI is that Hollywood and science fiction in general has created really unrealistic expectations for what AI is like, or can be like, or should be like. And it's different from things like teleportation or time travel or flying cars or any other things that you see in science fiction, because we don't have it. There's no real world implementation of any of those things, right? It's not like, oh, why isn't my time travel machine as good as the one in science fiction? We don't even have anything like that. So there's no point of comparison, but we do have working implementations of AI in our lives every day, right? You've got an AI assistant probably in your pocket or in your home right at this moment. And we've all grown up on, whether it be HAL 9000 or the Night Industries 2000 kit from Knight Rider, or C-3PO, or whatever version of AI that is that you've seen in a Hollywood movie or read in a book, where that AI is super smart, indistinguishable from a human personality, can do everything for you, robot servants, just these incredibly smart, AI agents that you can have realistic conversations with and can even pass for human. Now compare that to the real world implementation of AI, where I ask Siri to play me a Beatles song and she gives me directions to the movie theater, because AI is just not that good yet. The voice recognition is not that great. I have a self-driving AI in my Tesla, but I never use it because I just don't trust it. We're just not there yet. And there is just a massive gap between the incredible utopian AI future that often is described in science fiction and the really, really kind of very rudimentary, very nascent implementations of AI that we actually see in our daily lives today.
Yeah, but we are very inspired by what you imagine, because that's, as I said, having a robot that will, AI robot, that will interact with humans as you think, as you show in the Star Wars movies, I think is something we are hoping would happen, because it's a very natural. In fact, we'll talk more about this when we go to the medicine section. I think that's because human-like quality will also make people feel like these robots have empathy and so on, an emotional connection and things like that. So the other thing is that recently we are hearing a lot about Mr. Elon Musk's plan for building humanoids, and he claims that's going to be even more of a deal than Tesla. And I know you made comments about the AI component in Tesla, and well, Elon Musk says it's kind of like the Tesla AI is the one that they're going to start, be putting into the humanoid and develop it. And so, what are your thoughts on that?
My first thought is if Elon Musk's humanoids are anything like the AI in his cars, he can keep it, because again, the AI in my car at least is very untrustworthy. And the few times that I've experimented with turning it on, it's done very weird things. I feel like I read a story in the news almost every week about, a Tesla autopilot driving, someone off a cliff or whatever. It's just, we like I said, we're just not there yet in terms of trust, especially when it comes to personal safety, right? Like when my Google Assistant or Siri or Alexa or whatever doesn't understand what I say, it's just irritating. If the AI in a car fails, then now you're talking about life or death type stuff. And when we get to robots walking around again, then we start to get into the more cautionary side. I think there's another reason why we're very cynical about AI, is that Hollywood's also conditioned us to believe that the most likely thing that will happen is it will go wrong, whether it be HAL 9000 refusing to open the pod bay doors, or Skynet, rising up and enslaving all of humanity, and Terminators running around. Generally, as science fiction authors, we love to catastrophize, and the most interesting all science fiction, all good fiction is based on drama and conflict. So a movie about an AI assistant that just does everything perfectly and does everything you want it to do wouldn't be very interesting. But if an AI were to rebel against you and it becomes a conflict type situation, then that's more interesting. So those tend to be the kind of stories we can tell. What can we go wrong? And so when we think about AI, and especially in Hollywood, we're almost always thinking about, well, what's the worst that can happen? So we're a little bit worried about giving AI too much control, because what happens if we're suddenly one day unable to take it back?
Yeah, I see that actually as a positive thing, Gary, because at Hopkins we have an Institute for Assured Autonomy, and where this is what we worry about: trustworthy AI. How can we make sure that when AI is built, it'll protect our privacy, and it will be robust to potential adversarial attacks, and it will be fair in its decision making and so on. And this is an evolving subject now. So trustworthy AI. So when you are imagining that things that could go wrong with AI, for us, it says, yeah, maybe that is possible. So how do we protect against that situation? Adversary example is something that we're all very concerned now, that somebody can hack into our cars or our AI systems and make it do weird things. So while you're right that people go to see movies not to be just have everything goody stuff. They like to have some scary things, right? So I think you're right in imagining that.
I tend to be fairly skeptical and cynical about it as well, but I don't necessarily think that if there's a scary AI future ahead of us, I think it's less to do with AIs becoming self-aware and becoming in some way antagonistic or malicious towards puny humans or that sort of thing. That seems very kind of far-fetched to me. What I think is probably more likely, if there's some kind of AI catastrophe in our future, is a perfectly well-meaning AI just misunderstanding an instruction and carrying out something that might be true to the letter of the law, but not to the spirit of the law. The Will Smith movie that was the adaptation of the Asimov book, I, Robot. A lot of people would tell you that's not a particularly faithful adaptation of the book, and it wasn't. But one thing that I thought that they did was really interesting was they came up with a really interesting workaround for Asimov's laws of robotics, right? The whole idea, well, robots can never turn against us because they're all governed by the laws of robotics that are designed to protect humans. But it's that tricky one, but that says, through a mission of action, I will not allow a human being to come to harm. In the movie, the way that the AI interprets that is, well, you humans are killing each other all the time. You're killing the planet. You're your own worst enemies. You're coming to harm all the time through your own actions. And so I'm going to step in and take your agency away from you and take control so you can no longer hurt yourselves. And so it's technically following the letter of the law. It's not allowing humans to come to harm, but it's doing so by taking our agency away from us.
Yeah, now we're talking a lot about Tesla cars and so on, and I've been fascinated by, as a growing up, looking at cars that talk to the the actor and so on. I think Knight Rider is the show, I believe, where I first saw the talking cars. So Hollywood did a lot of stuff with robots, but Hollywood also did a lot of stuff with smart cars that could fly, and cars that could talk and do all sorts of things. So how do you see that fitting into the AI narrative?
I mean, again, it's an interesting point of comparison because AI is something that is increasingly taking over the automotive industry. Like self-driving is obviously a huge motivator for a lot of the auto companies. I live in San Francisco, where almost every other car you see on the road is this company called Waymo that has all these the cars that are going around the city, constantly mapping like every inch of the city because they're trying to teach the cars how to navigate an urban environment. And it's very interesting work that they're doing. But again, I grew up watching Knight Rider, right? Where that car was, Kit was fully human, right? They just absolutely kind of destroyed the Turing test every time, right? It was a fully human character that could joke and had sardonic comments, and again, there was no limits on its AI. Again, they wrote that character like he was fully human. He was a friend to Michael Knight, right? You thought of him, and Michael would call it, "Hey, buddy!" Like they actually, it was almost like a buddy movie. Like the car was his buddy, right? Because Kit was so fully realized as a human agent, as a human character, and again, that is so different from what we see in our cars today. It's just, so I have a 10-year-old daughter, and when she was born, we were about 10 years ago, we were just kind of at the beginning of starting to think seriously about self-driving cars being on the road, and again, we were thinking in very kind of science fiction type terms about just cars wouldn't even have steering wheels, just jump in it, tell it where you want it to go. And again, we've grown up on science fiction, not just in Knight Rider. Remember in Total Recall, where Arnold Schwarzenegger wakes up in a Johnny cab, and there's like a little kind of like a plastic driver at the front that just takes you where you want to go. And so again, we've been conditioned. It doesn't seem that hard, right? Like a self-driving car, like just go left, right, stop at stop signs. It doesn't seem like the most fantastical iteration of AI in the real world, because as you know, once you actually get into it, there's a million decisions you make every day as a human that you're not even thinking about in order to safely drive a car. Right. That, like there's all kinds of trolley test kind of stuff that can trip up AI when it gets into those kind of situations. And I think that's one of the frustrations that we have, is that we're nowhere near close. Like I said, so 10 years ago, when my daughter was born, I remember thinking, man, by the time she's 16, 17 and can apply for a driver's license, she might not need to, because we may not be even making cars with steering wheels anymore. Like AI might be fully realized, and we're just going to have a whole new generation of cars that and drivers that never even need to learn to drive a car, because the car will just do it all for you. So 10 years on, we're now 7 years away. We're more than halfway to that goal. And now I'm much more skeptical about that, because the pace of the AI development and the pace at which we're 10 years on from where we were to where we are now, it still seems to me, as a layman, but as someone who drives one of these cars that has auto driving features, that we are a long way from being able to kind of take our hands off I've done it. Like there have been times when I've been on the freeway and the car's in self-driving mode, and I'll take my hand off the wheel to let it drive, and it's doing it. It can do it, but I feel deeply uncomfortable not being in control of the car. And I think it's partly because I know the technology is not fully realized. If it was 100 years in the future and these cars have been on the road for decades with zero accidents, I'm sure I'd feel much more comfortable. But it's not just that. It's not just that I feel like a bit of a guinea pig for this beta generation of AI, and I'm literally putting my life in the hands of this car when I take my hands off the wheel. But it's also because humans just like to be in control. And there is just something about the idea of surrendering control to a computer that is, I don't know, there's something I think there's something very deep wide in us that just doesn't like that idea. One of the things that we believe, that science fiction has also taught us to believe, is that humans should always be masters of machines, right? That should never flip. And again, when that does flip, whether it be Skynet or whatever kind of, HAL 9000, whatever kind of apocalyptic situation we imagine where the robots kind of rise up and take over, there's a reason why we keep telling those stories, because humans are terrified of that. They're not just the idea of like a revolution, but of the machines that we created to help us. Suddenly that dynamic flipping. Oh wait, we're not the masters anymore. Now we're the subservient ones. That's very scary, and because we prize our freedom and our liberty and our agency so much, that the idea of that being taken away from us by machines is deeply, deeply scary. And again, I see that every time I take my hands off the steering wheel, just for a second, surrendering control to a machine is something that my brain's just not hardwired to be happy about.
I have a test I can suggest you. This was suggested by Dr. Thomas Stratt, who used to be a DARPA program manager, and he was in charge of the DARPA Grand Challenge, and he oversaw that, some years ago. And he says, well, he says the test is you close your eyes and take your hands up and see when you're going to open your eyes, and that will pretty much tell you how confident you are about that. But I don't have a Tesla. But Gary, the evolution of self-driving cars is an interesting lesson in technology. While we may still not have the utopian thing of, gee, I'm going to just sit in the car and say, hey, take me someplace. But there are a lot of other things that came because we were trying to do that. For example, the protections that you get, lane changing, warning, and then if there is a possibility you may hit the car in front of you, and then suddenly the alarm comes in, and then there are, my cars, even a very inexpensive car, like a Toyota Corolla, has many of these features. So it basically has improved, I think, the safety when people drive, especially at night, if it is raining and you want to change lanes, and if there is a car in the next lane, it'll tell you, hey, don't do that, just wait. And that all came because our eventual goal was to have an autonomous car. So while we are not 100% there, but I think about 80% of things that we are seeing now in terms of collision avoidance, in terms of lane change warnings, in terms of blind spots, the moment there is a car in the next lane, if you put a signal, of course, it's going to give an alarm. Even otherwise, you see the red triangle in your side view mirrors, you can always look at them. And so sometimes they help you to avoid accidents. So as a technologist, I see that, the real thing is that I want to sit in a car and say, hey, take me to Hopkins. It's not there, but I think we have gained a lot. And in fact, if you look at the development of autonomous driving, it started in the mid 80s. I still remember when I was working with my mentor, Professor Azriel Rosenfeld, who was one of the founding fathers of computer vision. He was kind of looking out the window of his office and said, wouldn't it be fun if you put some cameras on a vehicle and have the vehicle run around the campus? He just said that, and then the first program was what was known as autonomous land vehicles, ALVs. And then I was not involved in that, but the second thing was called unmanned ground vehicles. So, in the early days, ALVs were done in collaboration between researchers at the University of Maryland and Martin Marietta Corporation. CMU people were involved in it, and so forth. So many computer vision groups saw this as an operational system where they can, implement algorithms and see how well it performs. So I was involved in the unmanned ground vehicle project. We would try to track moving things from moving vehicles, because pedestrians are moving, your vehicle is moving, you ought to be able to do that. And that actually created an interesting commercial outcome. You remember the digital image stabilization in video cameras? That came because we had to stabilize videos that are collected by a moving vehicle, because operators cannot see that, it will create, headaches for them. So we have to stabilize them. And that's exactly what was transferred to commercial, handheld video cameras and so forth. Then what happened was DARPA said, okay, we got to give a big push to it. So they started the Grand Challenge, And the first time they did, the goal was a much larger distance to drive autonomously. None of the vehicles could do. But right around 2004, a few vehicles did that, especially the one led by Sebastian Term's group, and then a couple of CMU vehicles. They kind of met the challenge, and Dr. Term then went to Google and started the Waymo and so forth. So I think this is still an evolving thing. And of course, there is a whole thing happening with this in the sky. unmanned aerial vehicles and so forth. We hear a lot about that, the predators and so forth. So I think, again, here it may be a situation. Uh, we probably should always have a driver, controlling the car, and the car can help, at various things. So I think that interaction is still something that, we have to imagine what is the best, strategy for that. Take it away, Gary.
I'm as much as I may sound skeptical about it, I'm actually in the long term, I'm still kind of fundamentally optimistic that we will get there. That maybe not within my lifetime, but I think there will be cars on the market that just don't have steering wheels, and the technology is such, and is again, it will take some years for, there'll be a lot of people like, well, let's see how they are on the road for a few years before I jump in and buy one. But eventually we'll get, like with any new technology, there were people who want to get on an airplane at first, right, until they were proven to be safe. And so we will eventually get there. It reminds me of a comedy. I can't remember where I saw it, but it was a comedy bit. It was two kids that were living far in the future when autonomous cars were the norm. And one kid was kind of saying to the other, way, explain it to me again. He was saying, okay, so cars used to have a steering wheel and pedals, right? And you had to do it all yourself. You had to control the car, and you had like an accelerator and a brake, and you couldn't just read a magazine or play a video game in the car like we do today. You had to be fully focused and driving the car all the time, because it was your job to, be aware of hazards, and you controlled the car. And the first kid's like, what? And nobody died? And he said, oh no, millions of people died. And so that's one other thing to remember, is that as much as you talk about, well, what if they crash? Humans crash cars every single day. There are fatal car crashes every single day. And I am optimistic. I do believe that ultimately we'll get to a point where, as autonomous cars become the norm, road traffic accidents, fatalities will go way down, because ultimately I do think that there'll be better decision makers. They don't fall asleep, they don't get distracted, they don't drink, they don't look at their phone, they don't text, right? All the kind of the human errors that result in car accidents today. You can get rid of all of those, and I think they will be replaced, but there will still be weird computer errors and glitches and things that will happen. I just think there'll be far less. So I'm ultimately optimistic. I'm less optimistic about it happening in my lifetime than I was 10 years ago, having seen what has been, again, the bar has been set really high by science fiction, always kind of dangling the shiny object, going, it's going to be this good, just you wait. But how long do we have to wait? Having watched kind of just the last 10 years of development since Tesla's been on the market, and the idea of self-driving cars has really started to seem like something that's achievable, it's been agonizingly slow. And so I think it's going to be a while longer before we get to the point where we really trust our lives and our families and our children's lives in a self-driving car, and they become the norm. But I do think it'll eventually happen.
Well, yeah, I think so too. There are a lot more Teslas now, I see, than just a few years ago. So I think people are willing to try and so forth, and we'll see how it all works out. Now, the third thing I want to talk about is AI. Right from the beginning, people thought will help providing better healthcare and may help us invent new things in medicine. For example, even in the early 70s. There was a system that was developed with 500 rules. In those days, rule-based AI was the thing, and it was called MySyn. And try to figure out some issues with the blood infection and so on. So the domain experts and the AI researchers sat down and created this system. I don't think it got a lot of clinical experience, but it had a lot of interactions. You can query it, and it'll tell you, go and find, get more data, more tests. So it's somewhat interpretable. That's one of the concerns we have these days. And then it really helped you to make good decisions, right? And then of course IBM Watson kind of happened in the cancer space and so forth. I think we are now looking at AI. Hopefully, would make a big impact in how we provide healthcare, and how it will help us to find new cures and new discoveries and so on. Especially AI with genomics and so forth is very, very hot area right now. At Hopkins, we we have a new initiative known as AI Technology Collaboratory, which was funded by National Institute of Aging last year. I'm working with the two geriatric physicians, Dr. Jeremy Walston and Dr. Peter Abadir, and also Dr. Greg Hager, who is a roboticist and a computer vision researcher in the computer science department. It's a 5-year effort. So we're going to explore what AI and related technologies can do for healthy aging. As you know, there are more and more wearable sensors. We can collect data, and also we can have robot also is part of this. A robot can kind of stay with an elderly person and kind of make sure the person is doing okay, and remind the person to take medications and eat at the right time and so forth, and maybe entertain and so on. They say loneliness was one of the serious issues during the pandemic time, especially for people who were living by themselves and so forth. So the goal here is healthy aging. People like to age in their own home, in their own homes, and in the environments they're comfortable with, rather than spending time in nursing home and so on. So we hope AI would make a big impact in medicine and healthcare. So, as a person who imagines things, what would you think we can think of what AI, could do? I remember you told me the Star Wars doctors were all robots.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's funny, even though I worked in Star Wars for like 5 years, writing in a variety of different mediums, and I was, I did a lot of research, and I really, lived in that world for a long time. And then before that, for decades before, I was a fan, and I consumed everything. I never really thought about that until we discussed it, and I realized that there aren't any human doctors in Star Wars that I'm aware of. That basically, anytime you see any kind of medical procedure being, there may be things in like the books and the comics that are kind of like more deeply entrenched, but in terms of like mainstream Star Wars, think about the movies that think about like the original trilogy ones and the prequel movies. All of the medical procedures, all of the health stuff is all done by robots. And I actually don't feel like that's George Lucas at some point must have made a deliberate decision. I don't think it happens that way by accident. I'd love to ask him like why he thought that was an interesting way to go about it. But you think when Luke gets when Luke is injured in Empire Strikes Back, there's 2 times he needs medical attention, right? One time he's kind of knocked off, he's attacked by that Wampa, and he ends up in a backed attack. There's a medical droid that's attending to him. When he gets his hand chopped off at the end of the movie, it gets reattached by a medical droid. When Luke and Leia are born in the prequels, it's a robot that delivers them. It's like a robot midwife. And there's all the medical procedures and all the hospital and all the health stuff. The idea of the medical droid, any Star Wars fan knows what a medical droid is. Like there's a whole specific class of droids that are just built and exist to provide healthcare. And I think that's, I don't know why the reason why, I just think it's really, really interesting. In terms of real world implementations, we talked about this a little bit when we prepped for this, the idea that a robot surgeon can have, the idea that the level of precision, right? You don't have to worry about like trembling hands or whatever. The level of precision is obviously going to be that much more perfect. Right. And robot surgery, I think there's already been like great advances in the area, and I think that's going to be something we'll see more of. What the robots, what that can't replace, of course, and it gets back to what we were talking about earlier, is bedside manner and things like that, right? Like before you have your surgery, you like to have the nice, competent doctor come and talk to you and say, I've done 1 million of these surgeries, or I've delivered 1 million babies. Don't worry about it. It's all good. You're going to be great. Kind of pat you on the head and make you feel good about the surgery. The robot can't do that part, right? It's never going to be able to do that. But the other thing that I never thought about that you just mentioned, I think is actually really fascinating, is the idea of AI as companionship for lonely people, and particularly the elderly. Somebody told me a terrible story the other day, and apparently it's very common. Someone who used to work in customer service for like a mobile phone company. Mm-hmm. And he told me that the elderly people would often call with a question about their bill. And he would realize that they didn't really have a question. They just wanted to talk to someone. Yes. They just wanted to hear a voice at the end of the phone, and they would start talking about their kids. And, they just wanted to, their own kids, maybe their husband has died or their wife has died. Yes. Their kids don't call anymore. They're at home alone. They're lonely. They're sad. And they'll just start calling customer service lines just to hear a human voice at the end of the phone. And my friend was telling sometimes I would feel so bad for them. I would just talk to them. And I wasn't supposed to, but I would just talk to them about their kids. And, these kind of weird kind of ersatz friendships would develop, and then people, you start to know them by name, and they would call back regularly, and that and that's heartwarming. But at the same time, more than anything, it's just tragic, right? That kind of loneliness. People could be so desperate for a human connection, they would just call a customer service line and speak to a stranger. That is an area where I could see like an AI companion filling in that role in a really useful way. And and what's perhaps nice about that is, to fulfill that function, an AI companion wouldn't even need to be terribly sophisticated, right?
That's right.
I'll talk to my dog. My dog doesn't understand a word that I'm saying, right? But I'll fill in the gaps. People will talk to their parrot or their goldfish or a potted plant that they have. And so the idea of like a basic, this actually might be, it's fascinating to think about now that you've mentioned it, could be one of the first like really useful implementations of, you know, kind of Turing test type AI, like, you know, AI companions. To come online, just for people that have no one else to talk to. And these are the kind of things that we don't often talk about in society, because it's sad, and these are often forgotten people, right? The elderly, people that have no one to talk to. But I could see that being hugely useful. And you don't want it to, you don't want that to turn into a crutch, right? Oh, here, mom, here's a robot for you to talk to, so you can stop calling and bothering me now, right? You don't want that to be a replacement. But for people who literally have nobody, right? And one of the things that we know about human needs is that social companionship and interaction and not feeling isolated and alone, that's so a thing that you literally go mad, right, if you don't have anyone to talk to. And so an AI companion that could simulate some kind of basic companionship and friendliness, like even just having someone to listen to you, even if it's an illusion, which in the case of AI we know it is. I think if you're happy to call a customer service line and talk to a stranger, I think you'd be equally, if not more, happy to talk to a little AI companion. Remember Castaway, when Tom Hanks basically became friends with the volleyball? And when it floated away, he was actually like heartbroken that it went away because that thing had become his friend. He created that volleyball character, Wilson, because he desperately needed companionship. He just wanted someone to talk to, and he created an illusion in his head that volleyball was a real person. He anthropomorphized it. And I can see a basic rudimentary implementation of an AI that's just good enough that the other person kind of fills in the gaps for it. That's actually a really interesting idea, and I think that's an implementation that we could say.
So as part of the initiative we have at Hopkins, I mentioned before, AI technology, we invite proposals from companies and other medical researchers to submit their ideas, and we fund them. And I know of a company that did the following. They took a robot and had a small iPad in its hands, and then the robot will visit nursing homes, especially visit people with late stage dementia who cannot even speak. And then through Zoom link, the robot will bring their families and other people, friends and so on, play the music. And they said that created a positive reaction for the person, because they couldn't speak, but they immediately were very awake. They were aware and they expressed happiness and so forth. So I think those are the kinds of things where we think. But Hopkins also has led the robot-assisted surgery research right around mid-90s. One of our distinguished Professor Russ Taylor in Computer Science Department, won a 10-year grant from National Science Foundation to do cutting-edge research on robot-assisted, medicine, focusing on surgery. At that time, as Russ likes to say, there was no industry at that time, So, and then you see all these Da Vinci things, the hands, the robot hands that surgeons use for doing very complicated surgery. In fact, I know some hospitals use them for valve replacement in the heart and so forth. So there is a lot of that going on in medicine. But I think what appeals to me is how robots can provide solace for people who are alone and provide companionship, even though they may know it's a robot, but after a while they may forget that it's a robot. It's somebody who is just like if a volleyball can create that of a relationship with Tom Hanks, because the guy, I've seen that movie many times. My wife doesn't let me watch the movie. She thinks it's too depressing, but I like to watch. I watched this movie many times. And that is very true. If a volleyball can create that, of course it's the imagination in a movie, but definitely a robot can fulfill the need. I think I want to now get to a topic that everybody is worried about. Gary, I want to start off by saying that we appreciate AI progress, especially since 2012, when deep learning became a technology. We're seeing a lot of improvements in performance in various tasks we do. There are many things that we worry about. If you train a system using one kind of data, if the data changes, how does the system work, right? That's one issue. We call it domain shift. Does it work everywhere? Tesla, it works great, let's say in Phoenix. Does it also work in New York City as well as Mumbai, right? Because there are different traffic conditions, different environment, different rules, and so on. And then, of course, we worry about bias because in face recognition research, it was shown that some of the existing algorithms don't do that great when faces of dark-skinned females and males are present. Now that has become a major issue of AI bias. How do you know that AI will take decisions that won't discriminate against subgroups of people? And of course, adversarial attacks is something that we are all looking at. Can something, hack into some Tesla and make it go the other way and so forth, right? So these are the issues that we kind of broadly put as trustworthy AI. We want AI to tell us the safe corridors where it operates, it can operate, and it knows, I can't do it, please take over. So we want to define those kinds of regions of safety. And that is what the Institute of Assured Autonomy at Hopkins is all focused about: trustworthy AI, trustworthy biometrics, trustworthy medicine, which will not have any disparities in terms of how people are treated and cured and so forth. So how do you see these concerns? I mean, the kind of concerns we have seen in Hollywood movies are a little different, that they go crazy and do stuff. But even a well-defined, well-intentioned AI may have some of these concerns. So how do you react to that?
Yeah, it goes back to what I said earlier, is I think that, it's less to do with, again, the James Cameron Terminator Skynet scenario, where Skynet becomes self-aware and it just decides that humans are a threat and are inferior or whatever. I think, again, it's more to do with, I think, computers that with the best of intentions misinterpreting what it is we want them to do, and that having some kind of negative, perhaps even catastrophic result. In terms of the bias, I mean, we see this all the time. I'm sure you're very familiar with this. It's been quite scandalous in recent years, where we're seeing that AI is prejudiced against black faces and things like that, and it doesn't recognize faces of people of color. But the reason why largely that's true is that human prejudices are filtering into it, because, again, go back to those Waymo cars, right? These cars can become intelligent, but only because we're manually teaching them. Like someone is manually driving those cars around San Francisco, training that car what San Francisco looks like, right? And so if you've got a human bias or a human prejudice in terms of the information that you're feeding a computer system, that bias is going to be then replicated in that system. Computers are only as smart as the humans who make them. And people, and I always thought it's interesting. People say, well, computers are infallible, they can't make mistakes. They kind of can, because computers are built by fallible people, right? We're fallible. If we built them by the transitive property, I would imagine that computers can also be fallible as well. And we see that all the time with the kind of racial bias in AI that has been in the news recently. Yeah. In terms of us not trusting AI or thinking about the negative consequences of it, I think that there's a couple of things at play. One is, again, Hollywood does have a part to play. We have shown audiences time and time again all the terrible things that can happen, whether it be HAL 9000, whether it be Skynet, whether it be any kind of like robot uprising or rebellion. I think we've actually been kind of fairly unimaginative in how we've done that, in right. Imagining that computers that AI will just one day decide to turn evil, right? I think that's like a fairly lazy and not particularly scientifically. There's not a lot of scientific basis for like how or why that would happen. I think it's like the well-meaning misinterpretation of something. Again, allow no human to come to harm and things like that. I think that is potentially more interesting because it's ironic, right? Oh, we built them to protect us. They think they're protecting us, but they're actually making things much worse. Is really interesting. And the other reason, it's got nothing to do with science fiction. It's just that all of these things are for the most part, made by large corporations. All of the stuff in my house is made by Apple and Google and Facebook, and we all know, because we're not stupid. None of these companies are benevolent organizations. They'll tell you that they exist to make your life better, but they don't. They exist to increase shareholder value. That's their primary function, is to make money. And if they can do that by violating your privacy through increasingly sophisticated voice recognition, as long as you don't notice, as long as they can get away with it, they're going to do that. And we know it's happening all the time. I had a very scary moment with my wife a year or two ago. It was time to buy a new mattress. Our mattress was, mattresses are only good for about 10 years and then you want to replace them. And I was in the kitchen with my wife and I said, I think we should start shopping for a new mattress. And that was the beginning and the end of the conversation. I didn't Google anything. I didn't ask Siri to look for mattresses for me. But Rama, you already know where this is going, right? The next day, I started getting Facebook and Google recommendations for mattresses. Why? Because Google heard me say that. And I don't care what these corporations tell you about who's listening or to what degree your privacy is being protected. That was the only conversation I had with my wife, was in the kitchen where there is a Google assistant. We should look for a new mattress. The next day I am getting Google recommendations for mattresses. So we all know what's going on. After that, I did an inventory the other day of all of the internet connected microphones and cameras in my house that have some kind of AI assistant, whether it be, here's one right now. Who's to know if this thing is listening to me or not right now, whether it be Siri, whether it be Alexa, whether it be Facebook, whether it be a Google assistant. There's so many, I think it was like 20 different devices. If you add up all the laptops and iPads and iPhones and computers and the little hockey puck thing that sits on the kitchen counter, quietly listening to you all the time, you forget that it's even there. I had about like 18 or 19 different devices. And I think this is the part that even George, I said it's Orwellian the other day, but I don't think even George Orwell could have imagined this. Like, again, the fear back then was governments, right? Is that, okay, the government is going to force you to have microphones and cameras in your house, kind of like the East German police back in the Stasi would put cameras and microphones in everyone's houses and they're listening to you whether you want to or not. I think what even Orwell didn't imagine was that it's not the government you need to fear. It's the corporations. And the genius of it is all of the microphones and the cameras inside my house, none of those were put there by force. Corporations convinced me to buy them and give them money to voluntarily set them up and put them in my house so that they can then learn more about me and sell me the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. That's the thing you always have to remember about companies like Facebook. Facebook isn't the product. You are the product. The data that they gain from you, everything that you type in, everything that you say in front of one of their microphones. And again, the AI component is the more robust, the more intelligent the AI becomes at understanding what you're saying and the context in which you're saying it, the more that information can be gathered and mined to sell your information to advertisers who can then try to sell you more things. That mattress thing was a deeply creepy moment of realization for me.
Yeah, I have, many others. I think we have experiences. We ask for something in an email and then the search comes. I think, privacy is a serious issue we all have to think about. And even in medicine, it's very, very serious, privacy, right? So there are methods, federated learning and so on, which can use data from other places, but no, models from other places and not data. So privacy preserving learning has become a big topic in AI. But the thing that you are saying is that I think we are always, comfort versus how much you want to lose your privacy, right? Some people like, oh, I'm getting, for example, if I go to a Nordstrom and if a person follows me and then to help me, I may sometimes think, why is this person following me? But sometimes I may say, oh, this person is trying to help me because I'm kind of lost. I don't know where to find things. So this balance of, being helped by an AI agent, at the same time, how much of our privacy we want to trade is still evolving. I think most of us should have a feeling of what we are giving up in terms of privacy and what we gain in terms of comfort, decision making or product selection or things like. I think that is still playing because, as you say, we've never had so many things that could listen to us and figure out what we are doing in our emails and Facebook chats and things like that. So that is a thing. But now I know we talked about bias in face recognition, and I want to now have the Saturday Night Club. I don't know if you saw that, Gary. It came recently. As you know, Amazon Go store has this idea that people can just go in and pick things up and come out, no cash registers, nothing.
Yeah, we have one here in San Francisco. It's weird. You feel like you're shoplifting. You can just grab stuff and walk right out.
Okay, we're going to see this clip now. Go ahead, Will. Yeah, this clip is very, it's funny. It's very well done. It's very intelligent, but it really points to the situation that any technology must win the minds and hearts of people for it to sustain. And so AI is no different. And I think people have to see the benefits of AI. And of course, AI, like any technology, has its issues. And so we have to start understanding the balance between the good it provides and the issues that we have to still tackle. Gary, you have some last few words, then we can go to the chat and see who has the questions.
I think the SNL clip is really funny, but the reason why it's funny, of course, is it's rooted in a truth, right? Not everyone's treated the same, right? And you can understand why, black people would be very uncomfortable with the idea of like walking out with something when that's the kind of thing they get unduly accused of doing all the time. I give you another example of it. I was Animal Crossing, very, very popular video game, where you kind of live on an island and you go to shops and you cultivate your garden and do things. I was talking to a black friend of mine who plays it, and there's a shop that you go to in Animal Crossing called Nook's Cranny. And when you go there, there are these two little characters, these two little bears called Timmy and Tommy Nook, and they run the shop. And they're very attentive. So everywhere you go in the shop, they're kind of following you around, going, "Oh, are you interested in this? Could we sell you that?" And they're always following you. Like everywhere you go, they're just like the AI of their programming just follow the shopper around all the time. I thought nothing of it. When I spoke to my black friend, they said that actually made me kind of uncomfortable because it reminds me of when I go to a grocery store, there's always like a store clerk who's kind of like following me around, making sure I'm not going to steal something because he assumes I'm going to do that because I'm black. And it really, really reminds you, not just in terms of how AI affects our life, but in all kinds of technology. And we're not all treated the same. And I guess if there's like an overall point for this is that technology, we talked about, again, the racial bias and facial recognition earlier. There's a million different examples of this from what we just saw at Amazon Go. The Animal Crossing example is that we don't all experience life the same way. And if AI and if technology is going to work for us as a human species, it has to work for everybody. Right, it has to work for everybody equally, and I think that's the great possibility, is that ultimately, if you can take the human bias out of the equation, one of the great benefits of AI as computers, they don't have bias, right? They're not raised to believe, they don't have racist dads or whatever who homeschool them and teach them kind of awful things that they then carry on into their adult lives. There is the opportunity for that, for technology to kind of improve that part of our lives. But again, you have to remove the human bias from the person who's programming it in the first place and teaching it how to behave. You raise, and it's weird. I think you raise an AI the way that a parent raises a child, right? You teach it everything about how it views the world. And if we can solve that problem, I can see that getting us a little bit closer to a utopian ideal. But clearly, again, just going back to just the facial recognition thing that we touched on earlier, which I think we thought was quite scandalous, shows us that we're still, some ways away from that.
Yeah, we are working on developing algorithms for bias mitigation, face recognition, and many other groups. I think ethical AI has become a very big discipline now, just for the reason. So I think we can stop here and look for questions in chat. Let me see. I have. Let me see. Let me go to the first question. So current, let's see. Neural networks have dominated AI for the past decade with so much data and computer power available. Now we are approaching the limits of their capabilities. What now are areas of research in AI are you most excited about? Well, I think one of the things we are learning is neural networks right now, the way they are trained to do AI, they require annotations, they require labels. As you know, in many disciplines, like in healthcare, medicine, you need experts to label. They have to put the bounding boxes around cancerous cells and so forth. It's becoming very expensive. And also, sensors are operating all the time. The traffic cameras, they are collecting data. So what is exciting for us right now is so-called self-supervised learning. Okay, can machines learn by just looking at the data without anybody telling them what this data is, and annotations and so forth. So this is something animals do very well. Many other species do very well. Just they're trained. They kind of see what's going on. and so forth. So self-supervised learning is what I am excited about. The second thing I am excited about, when AI started, it had domain knowledge very much built into it, right? I talked about mice in the rule-based system as an example. Now we have swung the pendulum all the way up to data-driven methods. I think I want to bring the domain and the data back, because in medicine, if you say domain is not important, you're basically saying the doctors are not important. That's not true. You cannot do AI in medicine without getting doctors on board. But then once you bring the domain in medicine, you know, for every disease, the conditions are different, the sensors are different, the data is different, the diagnosis is different. So it's not one single AI that's going to solve the medicine problem, maybe 1,001 AIs, because for every disease, the domain knowledge is different, the data is different, the interpretation is different. Okay, so these are the things that getting me excited. I think, Gary, there is a question for you. Are there notable examples of when real AI ideas have inspired you to create fictional AI examples or premises? And how do you differentiate the AI characters from other characters? What qualities feel AI-ish to you? Take it away, Gary.
So there's maybe again, it's Star Wars Day, so maybe an interesting way to tackle this would be to come at it from the Star Wars aspects. And I'll go back to what I said before in terms of not really thinking about the droids in Star Wars as artificially intelligent. Again, when I wrote K2SO, what makes him interesting, right, is his human. It's not the what makes C3PO interesting is not the fact that he can speak 6 million languages, right? That's something that obviously only a robot could do, right? No human could learn that many languages, but C3PO can do it because he has, you know, this kind of vast computer brain. That's cool, and it's useful when he's able to speak other languages. He's very useful in many situations when they need an interpreter, but that's not what makes him interesting as a character. What makes him interesting is actually all of his human flaws and neuroses, right? He's a deeply human character, C3PO, and that's what I think is so interesting about him. And where I make the distinction is, and this is where I think the science fiction part of it becomes interesting, is I don't think of C3PO as artificially intelligent. There's nothing artificial in my mind about his intelligence. It's just the difference is it's a synthetic intelligence rather than an organic biological intelligence. You know, we have chemicals and organic substances in our brains that all combine to create, you know, neurons and intelligence. C3PO has a synthetic version of that, but the end result is not mimicry. It's not an artificial mimicry of intelligence. It's not a simulation of intelligence. It's real intelligence. You can hurt his feelings. You can he feels things, and if that's not true, you know, why make him that way? Why would you deliberately create a robot to be that annoying, right? Nobody would do that. It's just who he is. He's grown and evolved to be that, in the same way that a human being grows and evolves and develops neuroses and personality flaws and traits based on a product of their environment and their upbringing, and just the chemistry of their brain. And where I think this gets really interesting is, again, thinking about this idea of, and this is way off in the future, and whether or not it'll ever happen, I don't know. It's not about the limits of artificial intelligence, which is how accurately can we simulate real intelligence, but can we actually create real intelligence, sentience, the ability for a computer to be truly self-aware and think and feel and be autonomous? And again, we get into the question of have rights. But perhaps the most interesting, one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek ever is from season 2 of Next Generation, called The Measure of a Man, which is essentially a big court case about whether or not Data has rights and should be considered an individual with the right of self-determination. Starfleet wants to disassemble him to learn more about how androids work, because he's the only one. And they consider him property. Picard and Riker consider him a friend and a crew member, as valid as any other. And the fact that he's made out of synthetic materials is irrelevant. He's fully self-aware, fully alive, just in a way that is different from, you know, from an organic being. And I think once we get to that point, if we can ever get there, that's when you start to get into really interesting moral and ethical questions.
Yeah, there's the question asking me, are there any times in my work where I've been inspired by fictional AI? I would say robots in Star Wars, surely, you know, definitely that. And also the talking car, you know, my work in UGV, unmanned ground vehicles, unmanned aerial vehicles. I mean, they don't talk, but they like to do things on their own. I can just send them away and they'll go and detect if somebody is there and track them and do all those kinds of things. Yeah. And there's also a question, a technical question: is supervised learning different from unsupervised learning? Not by a lot. There's some technical differences. One of the things we are doing is if how much can I learn a representation without the labels, and then use that representation for downstream tasks where labels are available. That is the new trend. And regarding the field of medicine, what, if anything, is being envisioned for AI and unsupervised learning applied to mental behavior health? I think unsupervised learning is used in the sense of clustering behaviors, into different possible groups. For example, agitated state of patients and normal state of patients. I think you can use gestures and facial expressions and so forth. You can do those sorts of things, but still, the performance of unsupervised techniques is, these days we are believing that it can potentially reach supervised methods. Supervised methods means you have labels and annotations. Not true for all tasks. So I think you have to kind of do the trade-off again between the performance and the fact that you don't have to wait for annotations. So this is still evolving. And there is a question for Gary, I think. Could an AI identify its own bias, or can only humans recognize and correct issues of bias in AI? I have an answer for that, but I'm going to let Gary
Well,
respond
I
to that.
suspect you have a much more learned answer than I do. That feels more like a Rama question than a Gary question. But for me, I will refer you back to, again, what I consider to be the difference between artificial and synthetic intelligence. I think something that is designed only to mimic intelligence probably is not. Again, to identify its own bias, that to me it speaks to a question of self-awareness, right? And that's what we always talk about when we talk about AI going right. As soon as it becomes self-aware, as soon as it's able to kind of have its own opinions about things, that's when we start to get afraid of computers, because at that point, computers become as unpredictable as humans are. Right? Humans are very unpredictable. One of the things we like about computers is they're predictable.
Yeah.
As soon as self-awareness and the ability to kind of to be kind of autonomous in your own thinking, and you don't know where a particular thought pattern might lead you, that is unpredictability, and that is scary for us. So, but I think in order to be able to identify your own bias or any kind of flaw in yourself, you need to be self-aware. You need to be able to kind of step outside of yourself and examine yourself. And I think that is something that strikes me as something that's only would only be possible if we were able to achieve true, again, the key is artificial, right? Not artificial, true, genuine intelligence, but through synthetic means, rather than a synthetic machine rather than the organic machines that we are. I don't think artificial intelligence would be able to do that, but I think maybe a synthetic intelligence would be able to.
So my take on that is, right now we kind of know what AI may be biased to. For example, in the case of face recognition, age is a possibility, gender is a possibility, and skin tone is a possibility. And then we try to correct existing face recognition systems by training them not to be biased. Could an AI identify its own bias? As Gary says, it has to be self-aware. It has to know. I mean, even we ourselves as humans may not know we have biases, right? Unless we sit down and think about it. Why did I do that? Why did I say that? And so forth. So there's always some kind of a reference, with respect to which we kind of can measure ourselves as biased and unbiased.
That's a really good point. It's asking a question about whether an AI can identify its own bias is interesting when you think about most humans can't even do that.
Yeah, that's right. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining. I especially want to thank Gary. It's been such a pleasure talking to you about these things. As
yes, it's been fascinating. Thank you so much. I could talk about this stuff all day.
Wonderful. And so I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Have a great day. There is a book that's going to be coming out of the BDP series at Hopkins. It's called Wavelength series. It's called Can We Trust AI? Please look for it in Amazon and so on. And so I'm going to thank everyone and thank Gary, and have a great day. Thank you.